All right, we made it. Video number 4 of this lecture. Okay, so we're going to talk about the decolonization that is taking place in the post-war world. I'm going to go through a number of places just very, very quickly. I apologize in advance. I'm not going to be doing any of these countries like truly what they deserve in terms of like details, but I just want to give you the overview in this part of the lecture. So here we go. We know that during in the time after World War II, a lot of places across the world that had been colonized by the Europeans and by the Americans start to decolonize. This had been a movement that was sort of long time in the process. If you're thinking about change in continuity, after World War I, actually, Woodrow Wilson, one of his 14 points was calling for decolonization of the world. But of course, Europeans and Americans were not ready to give up their colonies because they got a lot of benefit from colonies. So finally, Woodrow Wilson's ideas start to become realities in the post-World War II world. So one example of decolonization in the post-war world that is the decolonization process that's influenced heavily by the context of the Cold War is what's happening in Southeast Asia. So since the late 1800s, most of Southeast Asia had been colonized by Europeans, especially by the French. As you can see here, the areas that are today like Burma, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were one large, basically, colony of the French that they referred to as Indochina. So after World War II had ended, there was a big independence movement in the area now known as Vietnam. And that independence movement was led by this guy. His name is Ho Chi Minh. He basically declares Vietnamese independence in 1945. His army had actually fought off the Japanese during World War II, and he puts out this statement of independence in which he says, look, the French have mistreated us for all of these years that we've been their colonists. They've put heavy taxes on us. They've not tried to provide education or jobs to us or uplift us in any way. They've segregated us against ourselves as sort of a divide and conquer strategy. We had to fight off the Japanese alone. Basically, we deserve our independence. We're free. The French were not all on board with that, and a war breaks out. That's called the First Indochina War. In this conflict, the French are fighting to maintain control over the Southeast Asia region that they're calling Indochina, and the Vietnamese people under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh are fighting for independence for what they want as a new nation called Vietnam. Long story short, the French lose. And so, yay, you might think okay, great, Vietnam is independent and that's that, end of story. Not so quick. One of the issues that immediately comes up is that Ho Chi Minh is a communist. And in 1954, when this First Indochina War ends, we have to think kind of what else is going on in the world. By 1954, China had become a communist country. By 1954, the Korean War had ended. So there's a lot going on in this part of the world that has proven that communism has the potential to gain a foothold in Asia. So the United States particularly is not too eager to have Ho Chi Minh be in charge of now all of this region and have it become a communist area. So in 1954, the meeting that they hold sort of at the end of the war to determine what's going to happen takes place in Geneva in Switzerland. And they draft up something called the Geneva Accords. And in the Geneva Accords, it basically formally renounces French claims over the land, so the French are officially out. But then, instead of just granting independence to Vietnam, you earned it, here you go, they take Vietnam and they divide it along the 17th parallel. So this ends up playing out very much like what happened in Korea. That north of the 17th parallel, Ho Chi Minh sets up a communist government. South of the 17th parallel, there is a capitalist government that the United States supports. There was some criticism even in this time period of this choice. This is a cartoon by one of my favorite American cartoonists named Herb Bloch. Here he's criticizing that decision made at the Geneva Accords to partition Vietnam. And the title of the cartoon, How About Sending Them a Flag, really reiterates that. How come we're not just giving them total independence? Why are we sort of dividing them in this sense? Long story short, what ends up happening, and they talk about this in chapter 29, so I won't talk about it too much right now, but basically the North invades the South in an attempt to reunify the two Vietnams under one rule, just kind of like what happened with Korea. The United States gets involved, and that's what the Americans call the Vietnam War, but what the Vietnamese will call the Second Indochina War. So basically, the decolonization process in Southeast Asia is really complicated by the fact that the Cold War is like the backdrop for all of this. It adds this extra layer of, issue and of conflict for this region. The next place we're looking at really quickly is Algeria. Spielvogel talks a lot about how, across the African continent, there are widespread independence movements. The one in Algeria is a little bit different than some of the others, and just because Algeria, which was a French colony during this time period, is also home to about 2 million French citizens. So when I say that, I mean like white French people. So these Europeans who are living in Algeria are sometimes referred to as the Pieds Noirs, which means black feet in French. I don't know exactly why they're called that, but that was sort of the nickname given to the Europeans living in Algeria. So because there were so many, I think Spielvogel cites 2 million. This particular graph cites 1 million, over 1 million in 1960. But regardless, because there were so many white Europeans living in this part of Africa, the French government was not eager to give up Algeria. They wanted to keep it to allow those French citizens to stay in Algeria. And those French citizens in Algeria also wanted Algeria to stay a colony so that they could stay there as well. So anyways, a war for independence breaks out. Eventually, the native Algerians do win their independence from France. And as a result, most of those Pieds Noirs end up leaving Algeria and going to France, because now, they're French citizens and Algeria is no longer like an extension of their home country. The issue with Algeria had come up a number of times at the United Nations. Again, the United Nations is really an organization, born in the middle of this Cold War context, and I think it's really interesting to see how they react to many of these decolonization movements. I hyperlinked, there we go. Here we go. I hyperlinked in here 2 things for you to look at. The first one is kind of a summary in 1959 of some of the issues that Algeria was having. Basically, it outlines their issues with France and why they deserve to be an independent nation. The second one is actually the full PDF of this image. This is a screenshot of that PDF. It's the 1961 UN General Assembly meeting in which they discuss what should happen with Algeria. For the most part, the United Nations by the 1960s was recommending that Algeria should receive its independence from the French. One other impact of Algeria's independence movement that was pretty negative was what happened to the Harkis. So the Harkis, one who is pictured here, were Muslims living in Muslim Algerians who had fought on the side of the French during the Independence War. And as a result of that, when the war is over, many Harkis were murdered by the Algerian government for their participation in, on the side of the French, but I think also as a larger part of an anti-Islamic movement that was growing in some parts of Africa. So again, we can see that an independent situation in Northern Africa, much like in Vietnam, brings up a lot of other sort of dramas and conflicts. On the other end of the African continent, in South Africa, we know that the South Africa as a country had already received its independence from Great Britain. We also maybe remember a little bit about South Africa's history as a colony. Before being under the control of the British, it was under the control of the Dutch. Remember we talked a long time ago about the Boer Wars. The Boers being those white Dutch settlers who had settled in South Africa. So anyways, one thing that's important about South Africa during this era is, even though they're not necessarily decolonizing, so to speak, they're undergoing something that is very important to know in terms of world history, and that is the apartheid era. So in South Africa, most of the government was run by white European like South Africans. So these are people who are citizens of the country of South Africa, but they are white. A lot of times the word used for them is the Afrikaners. These are typically people who are descendants of the Dutch. And so the government is essentially being run by these white South Africans, but there's a huge population of the native, like black South Africans who live there as well, who start to become discriminated against very strongly between 1948 and 1990. And it is this era that's known as the apartheid era. In the apartheid era, there were basically tons of racist laws that prevented black South Africans from receiving equal treatment and equal opportunities to white Afrikaners. And so, like, this is an example, like restaurants and movie theaters and schools and all that kind of stuff, neighborhoods were racially segregated. So kind of similar to what was going on in the United States, like in our civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, was taking place throughout South Africa for the duration of the second half of the 20th century. And so the treatment of black South Africans by the white Afrikaners was incredibly horrible. And completely unequal. One group, a political group that had been created in like 1912 to fight for black South Africans' political rights was the ANC, or the African National Congress. One of their most famous members is Nelson Mandela. So they are out there fighting against apartheid in the 1940s. Nelson Mandela is actually imprisoned for like 50 years almost. Because of his sort of political activism. Eventually, when he is released, he becomes president of South Africa, and he is just was an internationally renowned figure, Nobel Peace Prize winner, etc. So anyways, one thing that we do want to understand is that like this, even this, which seems like an issue of like just plain old justice, like how could these apartheid laws, they're not just, they're not fair. Even this issue, though, became a little bit colored by the context of the Cold War. One of the complicating factors is that the ANC and the other political activist parties for black South Africans, they were getting support from the Soviet Union. And so sometimes their enemies, domestic and international, would say like, oh, well, the ANC, they're just a bunch of communists, as a way to discredit them. And so it becomes even like more of a complicated issue during the time of the Cold War because of that historical context. This is a photo from a performance that was given in the 1980s, a Free Nelson Mandela performance. This is actually a performance that was given in East Berlin, so under the Soviet-controlled part of Berlin. And so you can kind of understand how this issue becomes more than just like, I don't know, the issue of like what's fair and just and what's not. It also becomes complicated and muddied by the fact that the United States and their allies are really against communists and their allies during this time period. Speaking quickly about the Middle East, oh my gosh, there is like literally so much we could talk about the Israel-Palestine situation. We're just going to do the very, very brief version. Going way back to World War I, actually, there had been a lot of discussion between the British and the French particularly about what should happen at the end of World War I, assuming that they were going to win World War I, when the Ottomans would lose their territory. And as something had been decided upon, it's called the Sykes-Picot Line. And essentially, the British and the French were going to take the Middle East, or the area basically that had used to be under the control of the Ottomans, and divide it roughly between the two of them. And they would each have sort of colonies in that area, or areas or land under their what's called sphere of influence. And so this map over here gives you kind of a better idea of, who got what. And so that's kind of the backstory that you need to know. In 1947, obviously, when World War II ends, like, people are understanding the horrible situation of the Holocaust. And so people generally have come to an agreement at this point in time that the Jewish people deserve a state of their own. Jewish people, as we know, we've talked about this during the year, have faced a number of oppressions and horrible treatment even since the time of the Black Death. And so by 1945, there was just kind of like a general consensus of that there should be a state, there should be a country for Jewish people where they can have self-rule, because then they won't be discriminated against, and they can have like all of their own, land and things like that. And so that was the state of Israel that was created in 1947. Where this state came from, I mean, you have to carve the land out of somewhere. You have to sort of take land from other people in order to give it to the Jewish people. The land that is important to the Jewish people is a land that's also important to a lot of other people, including Muslims, including Christians. And so the area that was carved out for them was part of the greater territory of what was called the Palestinian Mandate. It was under British sort of control. And so they carve out, you can see here, anything in orange is what they initially carved out of this area for a Jewish state. And then anything in yellow is for an Arab state. And so pretty much immediately once this took place, unfortunately, conflict broke out between the Israelis who were moving there, who were migrating there, and the Arabs of both the Palestinian region and their allies in places like Egypt and Syria. And so over the years, there have been many like ongoing conflicts as well as like actual wars between the Jewish state of Israel and their Arab neighbors. What we've seen generally as the trend is that almost every time there's been a major war, the Israelis have benefited. Israel has a strong relationship with the United States, and they have a very strong military. And so every time there's been a war, the Jewish state has expanded, but that comes sort of at the cost of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Arabs are losing their land, and they're facing a lot of conflict because now sometimes they are under the control of the Israeli state. And so it's just a very difficult and complicated situation that is an ongoing one. The last thing we're going to talk super quickly about is India. We know that India had been a British colony for many years. We also know that they'd been starting to push for independence. There had been a number of revolutions in India. We talked about that a couple of chapters ago. One of the issues when it came to giving India its independence was also a religious issue. Across India, there are different religions. British India, there were a number of different religions, the most dominant two being the Hindus and the Muslims, but there are others as well. There are Sikhs, there are people who practice, who are Jains, and so there was kind of an uncertainty about how to appropriately give India its independence in a way that would be fair for all of the groups. So this is a map from 1909 of the British Indian Empire. Anything in pink is majority Hindu, anything in green is majority Muslim. And so it looks, if you look at just this map, you're like, oh, this is easy. This part will be a state for Hindus. This part can be a state for the Muslims, but it's actually not that easy, and these maps give you a better idea of why it's not that easy. So these are also from 1909, and this gives you more specific percentages. So even though when we looked at the map on this slide, we could see that a majority of the big part was Hindus, when you look at this map, you can see that there's also a lot of Muslims in this region, and vice versa for Hindus in the mostly Muslim regions of India. And so that became the challenge about how to take India and sort of give it its independence in a responsible way where all people would get a government that they liked, essentially. What they eventually decided on was partitioning or dividing India. They essentially took British India and they split it into what is today called India, which was the majority Hindu area, and then they took the area that was the majority Muslim area and they made it into a state called West Pakistan, and then they created East Pakistan over here. Later on, that became known as Bangladesh. There's also this area that was kind of like unsure, and that is the region of Kashmir. As a result of the partition, there was a lot of violence and a lot of conflict. there had been some politicians who had been very opposed to partition. The best example is Mahatma Gandhi. He was an advocate for Indian independence, but he thought that if you took British India, and you split it up into all these different regions, that there would be a lot of violence that would follow. And he was basically right. Because, like we saw earlier, there were still a lot of Muslims in India. After the partition in 1947, they had to move basically to Pakistan. So there were these huge migrations of people from one side to the other, so that they could basically get into the right country that they were quote unquote supposed to be in. And so in all of that, there was a ton of violence throughout these migrations, and a lot of conflict. There today is still a significant amount of tension and drama between India and Pakistan. That is an ongoing conflict. This political cartoon really, I guess, foreshadows a lot of that conflict. Here you have Nehru and Jinnah, who is going to be the leader of Pakistan and the leader of India, and they are splitting it apart, right? They're doing the partition. They're splitting it into India and into Pakistan. Here's Gandhi in the background watching, not participating. We already know his opinion that he's not in favor of this. And then this over here is the British saying, "I only hope nothing goes wrong, madam," because what they're actually doing is that like magic trick that magicians do, right? Like they put the woman in the box and they saw her in half, but like, oh, she's totally fine, right? And so he's, Britain's sweating a little and saying, I hope this is all going to work out. But what we know is that it doesn't work out, that this partition of India creates so much conflict. These are some really interesting like perspective videos. Feel free to watch some or all of these. These are a variety of different people who lived through the partition of India in 1947. So there are Sikhs, there are Hindus, there are Muslims who speak about their experience with partition and how it has shaped their lives. Some of these, things are just like heartbreaking to hear, but I think they're really important to understand sort of the repercussions of the decolonization movement as it impacted British India. So that's it for today. I hope I was as brief as I promised to be. Don't forget to take the lecture quiz. I'll post it on Google Classroom later today. You should be all wrapped up with Chapter 28 by now. Don't forget to submit your art history message board. I'll post the Chapter 28 review quiz tomorrow. And don't forget, if you have any ideas for an intro song for my lectures, I would love to hear them. You can submit those suggestions into the lecture quiz, or always feel free to email me. But anyways, great. Hope you got a lot out of this. Let me know if you have any questions or any feedback for me, and enjoy the rest of your day. I will be catching up with you on another lecture in a few days.